King Henry VIII today is buried inside of a rather small burial vault in St George's Chapel inside Windsor Castle. It's not what he wanted, as the notorious Tudor King greatly wished to be interred inside a huge tomb and memorial which would be the biggest ever made on English soil. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547 inside his bedchambers at the Palace of Whitehall, and he would, following this, be succeeded by his son, Edward VI. He left many instructions for his funeral and death, including that his son should be helped by a regency council, and he would also state that he wanted to be buried alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour, who had died following the birth of her son, his successor. But Henry VIII is known for a chaotic and bloody reign over his people, in which 70,000 were sent to their deaths to be executed. This equates to around 3% of the population. But there is a rather untold story of the king's remains and coffin, and it involves a curious soldier stealing the bones of the most infamous King of England. But what is the story of the stolen bones of King Henry VIII? Following Henry VIII's death, his body was embalmed and then laid inside of a lead-lined casket and coffin. This was said to have been a huge coffin to hold the remains of the overweight king. But Henry's body was cut open, and his heart and other vital organs and entrails were removed, and then, it's believed, were buried elsewhere inside of caskets away from his body. This was normal for kings and queens to have this done to them as a way of preserving the body, and it would have also been normal for Henry's body to be wrapped in a cerecloth, a thick wax-coated cloth which was also said to have preserved the body well. Following this, the body lay in state inside of the Palace of Whitehall's presence chamber until it was time for the funeral procession to begin. The funeral procession of Henry VIII was incredibly long, and it was 4 miles in total from start to finish. The funeral cortege was draped in black, and on top of the king's coffin was a royal regalia, including an effigy of the king and jewels-encrusted clothes, as well as the king's crown. For many who witnessed the procession, it was the first time they had seen their king and an image of the man who had ruled for almost 4 decades over them. But the procession continued with the coffin pulled by 4 large horses, and it would rest for the night inside of Sion Abbey, as the procession needed to rest on its way from London to Windsor, and specifically St George's Chapel. It's here where it's considered that the king's remains may have exploded inside of the coffin and caused some damage to the wooden box holding the king's body. This is important for later in the video, as this damaged coffin would offer an opportunist a chance to steal the bones of Henry VIII. Following the procession getting to Windsor, the coffin was carried by 16 strong yeomen of the guard, as it was so incredibly heavy. The funeral service took place, and then the coffin was lowered into the burial vault under the choir, and with this Henry VIII was reunited in the burial vault with the remains of his third wife, Jane Seymour. But this burial vault was opened a number of times, and the coffin of Henry VIII was disturbed. The most notable time this happened was when the executed king, Charles I, was buried inside of the same vault, with his large coffin being placed directly next to Henry's. This would have outraged the Tudor monarch, as he hated the Stuarts and would even ban them forever from becoming the kings of England, something which would happen following the death of Henry's daughter Elizabeth I. But when the coffin of Charles I was moved into the vault, the workers had to also move Henry's coffin, and it was said this was already in a bad way and that the coffin sustained some damage. The tomb, when it was opened in 1649, was surveyed, and it was said that Henry's coffin was a wreck and that the exterior wood coffin was in fragments, meaning it had broken. The inner lead-lined coffin appeared as if it had been beaten in with violence about the middle, leading to the possibility that someone had been in the vault before and had been tampering with Henry's remains. During this moment, it's also said that Henry's skeleton, including his skull, was visible and could be seen, and that his skull had traces of beard on it, meaning that Henry's body for decades had been exposed to the elements. It's possible that the explosion inside of Sion Abbey may have caused this, or that someone had tampered with it. This was shocking compared to the coffin of Jane Seymour, who was buried years earlier, but her coffin was in perfect condition. There are no records of repair work being conducted on Henry VIII's coffin, as it should have been, and there were no records of Henry then being buried or placed inside of a different coffin, which would have helped to have preserved his body, and this would have been much more dignified. But the gaping holes in Henry's coffin would lead to a curious foot soldier creeping into the burial vault of Henry VIII and Charles I, and he would allegedly then steal one of the notorious Tudor King's bones. It was said in an account that the sexton did his best to clear the chapel. Nevertheless, Isaac, the sexton's man, said that a foot soldier had hid himself, so he was not discerned, and being greedy of prey, crept into the vault and cut so much of the velvet pall that covered the great body as he judged would hardly be missed, and wimpled also a hole through the said coffin that was largest, probably fancying that there was something well worth his adventure. The section at his opening the door espied the sacrilegious person who, being searched, a bone was found about him, with which he said he had a knife. The governor being therefore informed of, he gave him his reward, and the lords and other presents were convinced that a real body was in the great coffin, which some before had scrupled. The great body being referred to in this account is the body of King Henry VIII, whose coffin was known to have been much larger. In this, it suggests that a foot soldier broke into the burial vault of the Tudor King, and then he put a hole inside of the large decaying coffin, and with this he then reached into the coffin and stole one of Henry VIII's bones. He claimed that he wanted to use the bone to make a handle for a knife, meaning a bone of the most infamous Tudor King would be used to make the handle of a rather common weapon. But this theft was discovered, and it's believed that the bone was then presumably returned to the coffin of King Henry VIII. Later, the vault of Henry VIII was opened again, as the body of one of Queen Anne's children was placed at the feet of King Henry. But in 1813, the vault was then rediscovered after it was lost time. But this vault was then explored by Sir Henry Halford, who wrote an account of the discovery, which he claimed happened by accident when excavating the floor to prepare the royal mausoleum for the current king. But during this, they peered at the body of Henry VIII through the holes in his coffin. But the person they were most interested in was Charles I, to make sure that it was really his body inside of the coffin, and not that of an impostor. They opened the coffin and found that it was Charles, and that his head had come off from the body again after it had been sewn back on. But the vault would finally be opened a last time in 1888 to return relics of Charles I, the executed king, which had been taken. Henry VIII still lies inside of the burial vault, which he did not want to be interred in. His magnificent tomb that he planned would never be made, and because of this, 500 years on, his body is still in the burial vault, exposed to the elements. The holes and damage in his coffin would have sped up the decay process, and it's likely that only bones remains of Henry VIII today. But there have been no attempts recorded to place his body inside of a new coffin, but the story in which one of his bones was taken is shocking and incredible. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.